The cook who saved D-Day. Nobody knows his name. On the morning of June 6, 1944, at approximately 07:15, on a 200-yard stretch of Omaha Beach that the Army had designated Easy Red Sector, the 1st Infantry Division's assault on Nazi-occupied France had stopped. Not slowed, not stalled, stopped. The men who had made it to the beach were pinned behind a 4-foot concrete seawall with German machine guns firing from 3 directions and nowhere to go, and officers dead or wounded or frozen, and the plan that had taken 18 months to build had lasted exactly 11 minutes before the beach swallowed it whole. There were approximately 240 men behind that seawall. They were not cowards. They were not poorly trained. They were men who had landed in the wrong place, without their tanks, which had sunk, without their artillery, which had not fired accurately, into defenses that were stronger than the intelligence had said they would be, and they were being killed at a rate that made forward movement seem like a choice between 2 kinds of dying. In approximately 4 minutes, if nothing changed, the German gunners were going to walk their fire down the length of that seawall, and there was not going to be much left of the 240 men behind it. What changed was a cook from Tuskegee, Alabama, named Samuel J. Williams, who had not been issued a combat weapon because the United States Army in 1944 did not issue combat weapons to men assigned to mess duty, which was where they put Samuel Williams because Samuel Williams was black. And in the United States Army in 1944, black men cooked and drove trucks and unloaded ships, and did not, under the official policy of a military that was fighting a war against a regime built on racial hierarchy, fight. Samuel Williams had a kitchen knife, a grenade he had picked up off a dead man in the water, and 22 years of being told what he was not allowed to do. He stood up from behind that seawall and he started moving. What happened in the next 6 minutes determined whether the men behind that seawall lived or died. The Army's official record of the action at Easy Red Sector on June 6, 1944, does not mention his name. It never did. This is his story. It is past time that someone told it. Samuel James Williams was born on March 3, 1922, in Tuskegee, Alabama, which is a name that carries weight in American history for reasons that have everything to do with what his country thought of men who looked like him. Tuskegee was the home of the Tuskegee Institute, founded by Booker T. Washington, the institution that had trained generations of black Americans in trades and professions in the teeth of a society that did not want them trained in anything. It was also the home of the Tuskegee Airmen, the 332nd Fighter Group, the black pilots who flew escort for bombers over Europe and who had to prove every single day not just that they were good pilots, but that black men could be good pilots, which should not have required proof, but in America in 1944 required proof every single mission. Samuel Williams grew up knowing both of these things. He grew up knowing that the men in his community had to be twice as good to be considered half as capable, and that this was not a complaint about life, it was a fact of life. And you dealt with facts by working with them rather than being destroyed by them. His father, Robert Williams, ran a small grocery on the south side of Tuskegee, a man who knew every customer by name and extended credit to families who needed it, and who ran his store with a dignity and precision that Samuel absorbed the way you absorb the things your father does before you are old enough to understand what you are learning. His mother, Ida, cooked. Not as a job, as a vocation. The Williams kitchen on Jefferson Street was the kind of kitchen that people found reasons to be near, a place where the smell of what was being made could pull you through the back door from 100 yards away, where the food was not just sustenance, but a form of communication, a way of saying to the people around the table that they were seen and cared for, and that whatever the world outside the door thought of them, inside this kitchen they were valued completely. Samuel learned to cook the way he learned everything his mother did, by watching and then by doing, by understanding that feeding people was not a lesser skill, but a fundamental one, the skill that kept bodies working and spirits intact, the skill without which no army in history had ever functioned for more than 2 weeks. He was drafted in January of 1943 at age 20. He reported to Fort Benning, Georgia, carrying a single bag and the understanding that the army he was reporting to had already decided what he was allowed to be. The Army's policy on black soldiers in 1943 was shaped by a belief, stated in official military studies and repeated by officers who should have known better, that black men lacked the capacity for combat leadership and the temperament for sustained fighting, and should therefore be assigned to support roles where their limitations would not endanger the mission. This belief was false. It was demonstrably, historically, catastrophically false, and the men of the Tuskegee Airmen and the Buffalo Soldiers and the Harlem Hellfighters had been disproving it for generations. The Army believed it anyway because institutions believe what is convenient for them to believe, and it was convenient for the United States Army to believe that the men it was treating as second-class soldiers were second-class soldiers, because the alternative was admitting that the treatment was the problem and not the men. Samuel Williams was assigned to the 652nd Quartermaster Battalion, which was a support unit, which meant cooking and supply and logistics, which meant that when the 652nd was attached to the 1st Infantry Division for the Normandy landing, Samuel Williams's job was to come ashore after the assault waves had secured the beach and set up field kitchens and feed the men who had done the fighting. He was not supposed to be in the assault wave. He was not supposed to carry a weapon. He was not supposed to be anywhere near the seawall at Easy Red Sector at 07:15 on June 6, 1944. The landing craft that was carrying Samuel Williams and 11 other men from the 652nd was supposed to land at 0900 at a designated logistics beach area 300 yards east of the main assault zone. It landed at 0650 at Easy Red in the middle of the first wave because the coxswain was 19 years old, and the smoke and the noise and the complete collapse of everything that was supposed to be orderly had made navigation a matter of guessing, and his guess was wrong. The ramp went down. The men in the boat went into the water. 3 of the 12 were dead before they reached the beach. Samuel Williams made it to the beach. He made it to the seawall. He was soaking wet and had lost his pack in the water and had nothing on him except the kitchen knife in his belt, which he had kept there out of habit, because a cook without a knife is a cook who cannot work, and a grenade he had found floating next to the body of a soldier from the 16th Infantry who had gone down in the surf. He had picked up the grenade because it seemed wrong to leave it there, and because some part of his mind that was working faster than his conscious thoughts had understood that a grenade might be useful before this morning was over. He pressed himself against the seawall and looked at what was happening around him, and assessed it the way his mother had assessed a kitchen that needed to feed 40 people with ingredients for 20, which is to say, calmly, completely, without panic, looking for what was there rather than mourning what was not. What was there was this: 240 men behind a seawall going nowhere, 3 German machine gun positions on the bluff above the beach, 2 firing down the length of the sand, and 1 firing from an angle that covered the only obvious route up the bluff. Dead men in the water, wounded men on the sand who could not reach the seawall. Officers who were either casualties or pinned down or, in 2 cases he could see, simply frozen in the way that men sometimes freeze when the reality of what is happening exceeds every mental model they have ever built for what reality can be. He looked at the German position on the right, the one firing from the angle. He looked at the terrain between the seawall and the base of the bluff. He looked at the smoke from a burning vehicle on the beach that was drifting left and creating a screen across approximately 40 yards of the approach. He made his assessment in the time it took to breathe twice. Then he tapped the shoulder of the man next to him, a sergeant from the 16th Infantry named Paul Kovach, who was pressed so flat against the seawall he appeared to be trying to become part of it. Williams said, "Sergeant, the smoke is moving left. There's a gap in the angle on the right position. Somebody needs to go now before it clears." Kovach looked at him. Kovach had not previously noticed that Williams was not from his unit, or that he was not carrying a rifle, or that he was, in the Army's official categorization of the moment, a cook. Kovach said, "Who are you?" Williams said, "Samuel Williams, 652nd Quartermaster. I've got one grenade, and I've got maybe 40 seconds before that smoke clears. You need to send somebody up that gap right now." Kovach looked at the smoke. He looked at the gap. He looked at the German position. He was a combat sergeant with 18 months of training, and he could see exactly what Williams was describing, and he could see that Williams was right, and that the window was closing. He said, "I can't order you to do anything. You're not in my unit." Williams said, "I know." Then he went over the seawall. He moved in a low crouch along the base of the bluff, using the smoke as cover, keeping the burned vehicle between himself and the left side German positions. He moved the way a man moves when he is committed completely to a course of action, and fear has been reclassified from a reason to stop to information about the environment, useful but not decisive. The gap in the angle of fire from the right position was real, and it was closing, and he had approximately 20 seconds of cover left when he reached the base of the bluff and started climbing. The bluff at Easy Red was not vertical. It was a steep slope of sand and grass and low scrub, the kind of terrain you could climb if you were willing to climb fast, which Williams was. He went up the bluff on his hands and feet, staying low, staying in the scrub, moving diagonally to his left toward the right side German machine gun position. He could hear it firing. He could hear the rounds hitting the sand below him. He could hear the men behind the seawall, and he moved toward the sound of the machine gun instead of away from it because the men behind the seawall needed the machine gun to stop, and he was the only person currently in a position to stop it. He came up over the rim of the bluff 6 feet to the right of the German position. There were 3 men on the gun. He threw the grenade. He did not wait to see what happened. He was already moving left toward the next position, because in the seconds after a grenade detonates, there is a window of disorientation among anyone nearby, and he needed to use that window before it closed. The machine gun behind him stopped firing. Below him, at the seawall, Sergeant Kovach heard the grenade and looked up and saw the gun stop and understood what had happened, and did the thing that a combat sergeant with 18 months of training does when an opportunity opens. He got the men moving. He got them over the seawall and across the sand and up the bluff, using the route that Williams had just opened, the gap in the angle of fire that was now wider because one of the 3 guns covering it had gone silent. The men went up the bluff. Not all of them. Some of them were hit crossing the sand. But they went, which was the thing that had not been possible 30 seconds earlier, and the reason it was now possible was a cook from Tuskegee with a kitchen knife and 1 grenade who was still moving across the top of the bluff toward the second machine gun position when Kovach got the first man over the seawall. Williams reached the second position from the rear. The gunners had not yet understood what had happened to the position to their right. He had the kitchen knife. The details of what happened in the next 90 seconds are not something that needs to be described with precision. What needs to be said is that the second machine gun also stopped firing. Williams was wounded in the left arm during those 90 seconds, a wound serious enough that when Kovach reached the top of the bluff 3 minutes later with the first group of men from the beach, Williams was sitting against a German sandbag position, pressing his jacket against his arm with his right hand and watching the third machine gun position with the expression of a man calculating whether he had anything left to work with. He did not. He had the kitchen knife and nothing else. Kovacs arrived with men who had rifles, and the third position was dealt with by men who were equipped for the purpose, and the bluff at Easy Red sector was taken, and the men who had been pinned behind the seawall came up and moved inland, and D-Day at Easy Red continued toward its outcome, which was not victory easily or cleanly, but survival and progress and the beginning of the end of something that needed to end. Kovacs found a medic for Williams. The medic dressed the arm wound, which was serious but not life-threatening, a deep laceration from a German bayonet that would require surgery and 6 weeks of recovery. Kovacs sat next to Williams while the medic worked and said, "I need your name for my report." Williams gave it. Kovacs wrote it down. He wrote down everything Williams had done, the assessment at the seawall, the grenade, the bluff, the second position. He wrote it in the after-action report he filed 3 days later when there was time to file reports, and he submitted it through the proper channels, and he cited Williams for the Distinguished Service Cross, which is the second highest decoration the Army can award, and which Kovacs believed with complete conviction was the minimum appropriate recognition for what he had witnessed. The report went to battalion. Battalion forwarded it to regiment. Regiment reviewed it and noted that the cited soldier was from a quartermaster unit, not a combat unit, and that his presence in the assault wave was not authorized, and that the actions described, while commendable, had been conducted outside his assigned duties and without proper authorization, and that the question of whether a support soldier operating outside his assignment could be cited for a combat decoration was one that needed to be reviewed at division level. Division reviewed it. Division noted that the cited soldier was assigned to the 652nd Quartermaster Battalion, which was a segregated unit, which meant that the cited soldier was black, which meant that recognizing his actions with the Army's second highest combat decoration would create what the reviewing officer described in his notes as a public affairs complexity, given the Army's existing policy on the combat role of Negro soldiers, a policy which held that Negro soldiers were not suited for combat roles and which would be somewhat difficult to maintain in the face of a highly publicized account of a Negro cook who had done more in 6 minutes on Omaha Beach than most combat soldiers did in an entire campaign. The citation was downgraded to a soldier's medal, which is given for heroism not involving direct conflict with the enemy, which was a categorization that required ignoring a grenade, a knife, 2 machine gun positions, and a wound from a German bayonet, but which the Army managed to apply anyway. Then the soldier's medal recommendation also disappeared. There is no record of it being denied. It simply ceased to exist in the paperwork, the way things cease to exist in paperwork when the people responsible for the paperwork decide that the existence is inconvenient. Kovacs inquired 3 times about the status of his citation. He was told each time that the matter was under review. After the 3rd inquiry, he was reassigned to a different battalion in a different regiment, and the inquiry died with the reassignment. Williams was released from the field hospital in late July of 1944 and returned to the 652nd Quartermaster Battalion and spent the rest of the war doing what the Army had decided he was for, cooking, feeding the men who were officially allowed to fight, doing it well, doing it without complaint, at least not the kind of complaint that anyone in authority heard. He was discharged in December of 1945 with the rank of Private First Class, which was the rank he had held when he went into the water at Easy Red, which meant that 6 minutes on Omaha Beach had not moved him a single grade in the Army's estimation of his worth. He got on a bus in New Jersey and rode it south and arrived back in Tuskegee, Alabama in January of 1946. And the Tuskegee he came back to was the same Tuskegee he had left, which is to say, a place that knew its black citizens had served, and that was not sure what to do with that knowledge inside a social structure that had not changed because of the war and was not going to change without a fight. He went back to work. He cooked. He got a job at a diner on the south side of Tuskegee where a man named Mr. Henderson let him run the kitchen. And he ran it with the same precision and the same attention to what people needed and the same ability to feed 40 with ingredients for 20 that he had always had. He married a woman named Clara in 1948. Clara was a schoolteacher, a woman who taught third grade with a severity of purpose that her students remembered for the rest of their lives as the reason they could read. They had 4 children, 3 daughters, and a son. He did not talk about France. Clara knew he had been there because his discharge papers said so, and because he had a scar on his left arm that he would not explain, except to say he had gotten it in the war. She did not press him. She understood, with the instinct of a woman who had married a man who processed the world through action rather than words, that the explanation would come when he was ready, and that pressing it before he was ready would not produce the explanation, but would produce the closing of a door that she wanted to keep open. The explanation never came, not to Clara, not to his children, not to anyone in Tuskegee who knew him in the years after the war, which were the years of the Civil Rights Movement, of Montgomery and Birmingham and Selma, of men and women who were fighting for the things that Samuel Williams and the men of the 652nd and the Tuskegee Airmen and every black soldier who had served in a segregated military had been owed since the day they swore the oath. He watched all of it. He was not a public man. He was not a marcher or a speaker. He was a man who ran a kitchen and raised his children and paid his taxes and lived inside his community with the same quiet precision he brought to everything, but he watched what was happening in the streets of Alabama, and he felt it the way you feel things that have been building for a long time and are finally, at considerable cost, beginning to move. Paul Kovach found Samuel Williams in 1978. Kovach had retired from the Army as a lieutenant colonel and was living in Pittsburgh and had spent the preceding 15 years trying, intermittently and unsuccessfully, to find the man who had gone over the seawall at Easy Red on the morning of June 6, 1944. He found him through a veterans organization that had records of the 652nd Quartermaster Battalion, and he drove from Pittsburgh to Tuskegee in October of 1978, and he knocked on the door of the house on Jefferson Street where Samuel Williams had lived since 1953. Williams opened the door. Kovach said, "Mr. Williams, my name is Paul Kovach. I was a sergeant with the 16th Infantry at Omaha Beach. You saved my life. I've been trying to find you for 30 years. Williams looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You'd better come in." Clara made coffee. Kovach sat at the kitchen table in Tuskegee, Alabama, and told Samuel Williams everything that had happened with the citation, the downgrading, the disappearance, the reassignment, the 34 years of paperwork that had erased a Tuesday morning on a French beach from the official record. Williams listened. He did not say anything until Kovach was finished. Then he said, "I figured something like that happened." Kovach said, "I want to fix it. I want to submit a new citation. I've got my original report. I've got witness statements from 3 other men who were on that beach. I've got everything you need." Williams looked at his coffee. He was 56 years old, which meant he had been 22 on that beach, and the 34 years between those 2 numbers contained enough history, personal and national, to fill a library. He said, "Paul, what would it change?" Kovach said, "It would put your name in the record. It would say what you did. It would say the Army was wrong." Williams looked at him. Then he said, "The Army knew it was wrong in 1944. Knowing it was wrong didn't make it right then. A piece of paper now won't change what happened. Kovacs said, "It would change what people know." Williams was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "All right, for Clara, for the kids, so they know." Kovacs submitted the citation in January of 1979. He submitted it with his original report, with sworn statements from 3 veterans of Easy Red who had been behind that seawall and who had watched a man they did not know go over it, and with a 30-page letter explaining in precise and documented detail why the original citation had been suppressed and what the institutional reasoning had been. The Army reviewed it for 2 years. In 1981, the Department of the Army awarded Samuel J. Williams the Distinguished Service Cross, 37 years after the morning it had been earned. The ceremony was held at Fort Benning, Georgia, the same base where Samuel Williams had reported for induction in January of 1943 and been assigned to mess duty because the Army had already decided what he was allowed to be. A brigadier general put the medal around his neck. He shook Samuel Williams's hand and said that the Army was proud to honor his service. Samuel Williams thanked him. Clara cried. His children were there, all 4 of them, and his grandchildren and Paul Kovacs, who was 62 years old and had driven from Pittsburgh again, and who stood at attention during the ceremony with the bearing of a man who has been waiting a long time for something and is grateful it has finally arrived, even if the waiting was too long. After the ceremony, a reporter from a Birmingham newspaper asked Williams what he wanted people to take from his story. Williams thought about it for a moment. He said, "I want them to know that there were a lot of men like me, men who served and didn't get their names in the record, men who did what needed doing because it needed doing and because they believed in what this country was supposed to be, even when this country wasn't living up to it. I'm not the story. They're the story. I just happened to be the one somebody looked for." Samuel James Williams died on August 14, 1994, in Tuskegee, Alabama, at 72 years old. He is buried at Tuskegee, not far from the airfield where the men they called the Red Tails flew their missions and proved what needed to be proved. His headstone gives his name, his dates, his rank, and his decoration. It says Distinguished Service Cross. It took 37 years and a retired lieutenant colonel from Pittsburgh who would not stop looking to put those words on that stone. It should not have taken that long. It should not have taken a single day longer than June 6, 1944, when a cook from Alabama with a kitchen knife and 1 grenade stood up from behind a seawall and walked into German fire because the men around him needed him to, and because he had been told his whole life what he was not allowed to do, and had decided on that particular morning that he was done being told. The Army did not want to remember his name. We should not let them forget it. Samuel J. Williams, cook, soldier. The man who helped save Easy Red when the men who were supposed to save it could not move. Say his name.